Bonjour, Stego. My name is April Lindala, and I'm just really wanted to start with just a reminder of the beauty of the Upper Peninsula. A lot of my imagery that I'm sharing today is rooted in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It is the territory, of course. I like to do a territory acknowledgement, and I'm purposeful in my use of the word territory because we are so close to the most amazing, beautiful body of water on the planet, Lake Superior. And so beyond a land acknowledgement, I see territory acknowledgement to acknowledge that body of water. I'm coming to you from Northern Michigan University. I won't read this, but I wanted to share this picture as a means to acknowledge that our campus has taken steps here at NMU to have these territory acknowledgements visible and Ojibwa artwork and Ojibwa expression visible on the campus as a means to recognize the land that we're sharing and the territory that we're sharing where we live, work, and play. And so I just want to shout out to Dr. Carrie Schuling, our current president, who at the time when she was provost made sure to help us with increasing the visibility on our campus. So we are in what's called Gitchiname Bini Zibing, which refers to a life-sustaining river, better known as Marquette, Michigan. So it is a pleasure to be talking with you from there. Another image I have here is from of Lake Superior, right off of the highway. This is right as we're coming into Marquette if you're coming up from downstate. And that water is not a resource, it is the source. And so I think that's one of my biggest messages is how do we have a relationship with our water? Before I go there, I want to use this slide as a means to say this is what inspires me to do the work that I do in Native American studies. I will go to the lake when I need that sort of uplift, that sort of empowerment, that boost of energy to remind me Native American studies is a complex, sometimes challenging discipline. From what I've learned over the years being affiliated with Native American studies, there's a misconception that it's solely about Native peoples, it's solely about Native issues and topics. But Native American scholars must also really address what I call the Great Disruption, that which is imperialism and colonialism, because we have to acknowledge that historical and political context and recognize where we are today. Today, there is an amazing reclamation. There's a resurgence. There's a continued insistence, as Jolene Rickard would say, Tuscarora scholar Jolene Rickard, a continued insistence on who we are and our presence here. And so as far as the discipline of Indigenous studies goes, it's very holistic, and I can find myself in a lot of different areas. And Elena, in her wonderful introduction, touched on some of those, from food to science, to art, to social work, to education. And Indigenous studies allows us some of that flexibility and fluidity. But in it all, the core central tenet is centering the earth and remembering that we have to acknowledge our relationship to territory, our relationship to those beings that we share this one home, this one planet with. For the title of my talk, I use the term Indigenous obligations because whether it's for some people around the globe or some people locally, we have to remember and view these obligations because it's part of a reciprocal agreement, if you will, based on our information from those ancestral stories, those gifts that we have on this earth. And so in return, our obligation is to protect. Our obligation is to encourage regeneration. Our obligation is to recognize, honor, celebrate, take care of all beings that undergo and need our support. And we need their support just as much as they need ours. In fact, they could probably get along better without us, as many people would say. But it's about that idea of because we've been given these gifts, we have to, in turn, take care of them and protect them. Some of what I've learned and we'll be talking about today, I have learned from 30 years of being in Ojibwa and Anishinaabe territory. I know more about the Ojibwa ways of being than I do from my mother's people, the Haudenosaunee. And that I've lived my adult life up here, and I've had a lot of generous people in the Ojibwa territories guide me and teach me. But I must say, just as a bit of a memory, I lost somebody very dear to me not too long ago who has been a very important source of story and song. And so I just want to take that moment to recognize that person in my heart, because without that person's guidance, I would not know nearly as much as I do today. And then in turn, obligated to then return the gift by sharing what I've learned to share with you. I also use Indigenous obligation because we want to move beyond the sound bites. We want to know the information so well. And this is what I tell my Native studies students and Native students in college. We need to be able to stand up and speak in a confident and unwavering voice, not solely for ourselves and for the audience, but for the unborn 7 generations to follow in our footsteps. Our tribal nations deserve, and our unborn generations deserve, intellectual warriors to combat the unseen concerns of tomorrow. We know what some of those are in the idea of climate crisis. All right, so I put up, and I'm going to be repeating this image from Ojibwa artist Christine Belcourt. I admire her work very, very, very much. And I'm going to be sharing some outcomes, kind of some ways to help guide us in seeing what I would hope we would take away after this presentation. I would ask that when, I would ask you to keep thinking about this image as it comes up repeatedly. And I think part of the reason I chose this particular artist is because she has a major affinity for roots. In this image, as in many of her images, she concentrates on not just the beauty of the flower, but the beauty of the root. So my choice to include this artwork is to start with that as understanding the roots of the conversations that we have to have. We have to go deep and underneath surface level talking. So while people certainly love the color of flowers and the beauty and the brilliance of flowers, the root in this case may be considered as an analogy to represent the means for which the flowers actually are able to exist. The roots are those expressions and the areas where we need to go and regenerate for the flower to keep coming back year after year after year. I have this visual in a circle, and I know each one of these may be a little difficult to read, so don't worry. My goal is to share these learning outcomes individually on the slides, but what I also wanted to ask you to do is ask you to think about our conversation and these outcomes in the form of a circle, because they are interconnected and they all should be revolving around this idea in which we center the earth as the core conversation. Yes, we think about us as human-centric all the time, right? But this, I'm going to ask us to work on a little shifting with our personal paradigms in centering the earth first. And when you envision these outcomes in a circle, because we often create lists, which is very linear. I want us to think about them in ways that they connect to each other, build off of each other, and are centering around this primary, our mother, the earth. So we start in this territory in the east and we go clockwise. And so with our first learning outcome, which will return to Christy Belcourt's artwork, is distinguish a pan-Indigenous conversation from a tribal nation specific one. And this is a value to include a brief conversation upon, because there are pros and cons with the idea of talking about Indian country or pan-Indigenous, whether that be global, national, regional. Pan-Indigenous is the clustering together of all those individuals, communities, and nations that identify or are recognized as Indigenous. There are both positives and negatives to Pan-Indian conversations. And in this presentation, we don't have time to discuss those, but rather I would like you to distinguish consider the distinction between, nation, tribes, and bands. In the United States, for example, what is a federally recognized tribal nation? So in the territory where I'm situated currently, this is Ojibwe territory, but the Ojibwe are a part of the larger Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. Included in that confederacy are also the Odawa and the Potawatomi, also known as Budowatomi, right? So that confederacy is how treaties were initially made with groups of, or people, were these large groups of confederacies. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe Confederacy. Eventually, as time went on, treaties were made with distinct groups, such as just the Ojibwe or just the Odawa. Sometimes treaties were made with two groups, but they started to sort of slim down. Ojibwe in particular, and this is only a sample, this is not all Ojibwe, this is only a sample of Ojibwe. Then treaties started becoming discussed with tribes at a very specific distinction. So White Earth Band of Ojibwe, Lac du Flambeau Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, Keweenaw Indian Community. Those are the three U.S. Located tribal nations that I have on the screen. The other two, Batchewana and Garden River, are also Ojibwe, but they're across the border. They're across the river. We didn't draw that line there, right? So these lines actually have really consequences for Anishinaabe people, Ojibwe people, who have families on either side of the river and either side of that border. So we have to think about the fluidity of the word nation and what that looks like. Because it's a little bit complicated, because a White Earth Band member in Minnesota may be related to a Keweenaw Bay Indian community member in Michigan, but the two of them are going to have very different treaty rights based on where they're located and based on their treaties. And I only bring that up because I think that is some kind of that's a historical context in helping folks understand the complexity of how Indian country internally identifies itself. So back to learning outcome one, which is distinguish that pan-Indigenous conversation from a tribal one. Certainly Indigenous peoples around the globe have parallels in their shared historical experience, and as well as some parallels in their stories and their relationship to land. I'm not saying this is across the board, and certainly with modernity, that has even been disconnected even more for some groups. But the idea, there are a lot of Indigenous groups around the globe who have this fierce obligation of protection of territory, protection of water, protection of forest, protection of land, right? So I go back to the question of who gets to decide nationhood. So in regards to why is this conversation of significance? Because the question I want to ask is who gets to decide nationhood? One of the things I need to stress is that the language I am using is English, but Indigenous peoples have embedded different meanings using English words. Nationhood is one of those terms. So nationhood could certainly refer to the nation state, such as the United States. Nation could refer to Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy. Nation could refer to the Ojibwa Nation, or nation could refer to Lac du Flambeau as a distinct tribal nation that is recognized by the federal government. We don't have a lot of time to talk about the complications of recognition, but I'll throw that in there as a seed. In addition, regionally, we know that there are, at the regional level, communities, whether they be in urban centers or whether it be like understood as Great Lakes region, that will also come together as communities. So in fact, because I grew up in and around Detroit, the Urban Indian Health Center was very important to my mother and us as a family. And so we would rely on our community in the urban center. In fact, over 65% of Native peoples do not live on reservations or reserves. They live in urban centers. And so we have to remember that place may also be about being disconnected to place, right? And so that's one thing I make sure I want to also reference is the idea that because Indian people may live in urban centers and not have same connection to stories or practices, some do, but that's something to consider as well. So who gets to decide nationhood? This core question I want to talk about as we go on to our next outcome. And that is recognizing an expansive view of family from a pan-Indigenous lens. So one of the questions that's going to get asked in this territory and by many Indigenous people, even when I travel, is, what is your clan? So personally, from my mom, I'm Turtle Clan. And so when I meet Turtle Clan people from other territories, whether they're Ojibwe or whether they're from other communities and other tribes, they're still considered a relative. That turtle is our connection and they're still considered a relative to me, even though I may have never met them before. And this is a distinguishing factor that I think we're going to come back to in regards to nationhood. So these beings, all beings like clans, have specific responsibility. The Ojibwe have a number of clans, the Haudenosaunee have a number of clans. Our stories tell us that as humans, we have distinct responsibilities for protection of those particular clan beings. In addition, there are also stories, for example, in this territory of the Ojibwe, with the sturgeon. The sturgeon has the same responsibilities under the water that the Ojibwe have above the water. And so they're like a kind of a partnership, that the sturgeon takes care of things in the great waters of the lakes, and the people take care of what's above the water. Stories also share with us that even plants, such as cedar, have distinct responsibilities of protection. And so these stories are stories that inform us. So just as they have the capabilities of protecting us, we have the obligation to protect them. So through our clan relatives and our stories and other beings, Ojibwa people understand that the term nationhood and relative are fluid and expansive. This applies to other tribes as well, so that there is a vital difference in how a significant number of tribes view other beings on the earth and within the cosmos as having responsibilities and contributing to the interconnectivity of all beings. Recognizing that these terms of nationhood can be applied to Stone Nation, Plant Nation, Water Being Nation, Wing Being Nation, Four-Legged Nation, Birch Tree Nation, Maple Tree Nation, and so on. So similarly, we recognize that in some cases, these beings are our relatives through our clans, through our kinship ties, and through our responsibilities. So our next area I'd like to discuss is recognizing our intergenerational and interconnectivity linkage. And this is going to be specifically from an Anishinaabe-centric lens. So I include a little bit of language. I'm a language student, Ojibwa language student. And so I by no means, please don't ask me any questions about how to translate. That's not my role, but I'm learning language, and I'm learning language of place here. Because I think it's because I have a long relationship of living here, and I want to have the relationship with the language of the trees and the water and the territory from here. So Ninda Wemaganuk is my relatives, and Ni Ku Bide is a term those are two terms that I want to share with you. So intergenerationality is also something that we consider as central to informing our ways of living and being. While many tribal peoples believe there is interconnectivity to all living beings, as I mentioned, tribal peoples must also recognize the interconnectivity between generations. To draw from the Ojibwa peoples, their language has a word that helps us to pinpoint what is meant by this relationship between generations. The phrase that I have learned is Ni Ku Bide. The translation is my great-grandparent and my great-grandchild. So I'd ask you to think about this with regards to the self and how your self is connected, your selfhood is connected to your great-grandparent, and then in the future, your great-grandchild. So this informs your perception of self and the likeness of self from one generation to the next and the next and the next. So I've laid out this visual image to maybe help us think about that a little bit differently. So choices we make today will directly impact our grandchildren's grandchildren. More importantly, I would ask each of us to think about shifting our personal paradigm to remember that word for great-grandparent and great-grandchild, ni kubide. The choices we make today will in fact impact ourselves, our likeness in forthcoming generations. This is one reason why language is so vital, because we embed meaning in these words and terms. How did the Ojibwe embed meaning into this word in the past? How do they embed meaning into it today? And how will they in the future? As a side note, if you weren't aware, UNESCO has declared this to be the decade of Indigenous language. We are starting our second year of this decade of Indigenous language. And I can't stress enough that knowing Indigenous language is not merely about being able to speak with one another, but it's also, with regards to that embedded meaning, a change in how we think about things and I think about our relationships. So in regards to the concept of time and intergenerationality, can we speak to the quality of life on Earth for our grandchild's grandchild? I provide an average number of, let's say, 22 years as a generation. Technically speaking, it's 20 to 30 years. But if we count 7 generations times 22, that's a total of 154 years ago. What was happening to people, Indian people, 154 years ago? That's around 1868, 1869. And for Lakota people, that meant the Treaty of Fort Laramie. That's another presentation and conversation, but I wanted to just name it as an example to how thinking about 7 generations, both behind us and ahead of us, is something that's we attempt and strive to do as it informs us. And so I'll give you a little bit of a visual with that as well. So if we think 7 generations before us, and then the current day, and the 7 generations after us, and we have that sort of interconnectivity with generations, I would also ask you to think expansively about the intergenerations of our current day, and kind of think of yourself as an eagle. If you would fly 1 foot above the ground, 10 feet above the ground, 100 feet above the ground. So if you're flying 100 feet above the ground, you have a view scan of about 12 miles. And I provide the sources here for this map because this is not what I'm known for. So if you have 1,000-foot view, it's 39 miles. A 10,000-foot view is 123 miles. 100,000-foot view above the Earth's surface. One of our sources say that you will see what every astronaut sees just before breaking the barrier between sky and space. You can see, in essence, part of the globe. So we are connected to all living beings, both intergenerationally, and we have to think expansively about what it is for every single being to be a part of joining and being a part of this planet at one time. So this is a little bit of a responsibility when we're asking ourselves about our obligations. This is kind of an unusual visual because normally it would be a circle. With Native peoples, things happen in a circle. So I'd invite you to imagine, if you will, going back to our discussion of roots, that idea that there is a circle, and thinking about where exploration, quote unquote, is happening today. Not only has exploration been happening away from the planet out to the 100,000-foot view, exploration and extraction has been happening internal to the Earth. So the expansiveness of, quote unquote, discovery of new places is now going inside the Earth. And what has that been doing? So normally this would be a circle, and I just want to mention that because it is important to keep in mind. What does that mean to be going inside and exploring as well? I think we know the answers to that, but we have to think kind of large picture and big picture. And so I just wanted to make sure to offer that as well. All right, so if we had to identify one difference between Indigenous peoples and mainstream US society's concept of or connection to place, one of the things I would say is that if Ojibwe original instructions teach Ojibwe people that we are interconnected to all beings as family, including the land, rocks, and plants, how is it possible to view land as property? The concept of ownership of property for tribal nations in the Great Lakes was not a concept that would make sense. How does one own their grandmother? How does one protect their grandmother is a question that was and is understood, because this is about, for tribal nations, participating in renewal ceremonies that are associated with different time markers that arrive with natural law. For both the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, natural law as a time marker, the new year is when the ice breaks from the long winter and the water runs, so the rapids running. There is a renewal ceremony at this time, a gathering that acknowledges and honors this time of year. That is when the new year is seen. Additionally, because land was not viewed as property and protection and reproduction were central to living areas, there were tribal nations who did not garden in one spot or harvest in just one spot. They would move around and rotate in order to allow spaces to rejuvenate and flourish. And such practices, of course, were greatly disrupted because of the concept of property and the boarding school era's lessons of gardening and agriculture in one place. So that's going to be, really being mindful of that particular difference. So one Indigenous obligation in relation to territory, either the local or the global. In a time of climate crisis, what is a practice that can be done once the shift in thought takes place? Because I'm introducing concepts that may be different or distinct. I have one example. Alina, when she was introducing me, mentioned the Decolonizing Diet Project Cookbook. In November of 2010, my colleague, Dr. Martin Reinhardt Ojibwe, who teaches here with me, thought about how his ancestors ate. In March of 2012, a group of 25 research volunteers, myself included, undertook the year-long pledge to eat one meal a day with only Indigenous ingredients. Marty and another volunteer pledged 100%. And so for 1 year, okay, we decided we were going to do that. And we decided we were going to follow the natural law calendar. What I just talked about, specifically in this territory, we were going to wait for the sap to run in maple trees. Well, as luck would have it, the sap started running in the end of January, as opposed to the middle of March, where we thought it was going to run. And so we had to build in an arbitrary date of March 24th to be our kickoff date, because it was unusually warm weather, which caused the sap to run early. The project was one of the most transformative research endeavors that I ever participated in, and I was also on the project staff. Since that time, we have witnessed a major shift in thinking about Indigenous foodways, Indigenous agricultural practices, Indigenous harvest practices, and Indigenous food sovereignty. There are some who might feel that this shift in thinking is going backwards, and others yet that would love to commercialize the aspect of the diet on a grand scale. This practice is an extended local project. And what I mean by that is it's a little bit different from regional. It's an extended local in that the community made a collective decision to decide, what did the Great Lakes look like? So we didn't follow a map per se. We asked a number of people to contribute to an idea of what they thought the Great Lakes would be. And then Marty took everybody's map. We circled it. He took all these individual maps. And he had a big stamp. And from all of those maps, he, in essence, that was a decolonizing practice of, we were going to decide together as a group what the Great Lakes region looked like. So an extended local, because we did have areas that included Pennsylvania, because Great Lakes, there's 5 of them, and so reaches far east, and then in places of Minnesota, of course, and far south and far north. So the map was distinct in making it that way. So the decolonizing project itself, Diet Project, was like a renewal ceremony in that participants experienced transformation in how we related to the earth around us, because the earth was our food source. Yes, we did rely on stores, don't get me wrong, but it made a difference in really giving me an idea of what it means to disrupt the commercialization of foods when I'm relying on myself to gather, harvest, prepare those foods. I was responsible for obtaining food in different ways. We did that individually as well as collectively. And I think I would say that one of the things I also learned is it's one thing for me to use the quote from John Mohawk to discuss unborn generations, but because of our daily practice in gathering those foods and gathering, going out to harvest leeks, let's say in the month of May, or going to do sugar bush in the winter, end of winter, beginning of spring, going to do wild ricing in the fall. There was a deeper understanding, that roots understanding of what John Mohawk means by protecting and being connected to those unborn generations. That connection that the Ojibwa say is Ni Kubede, that grandchild, that great grandchild is of myself. And so I, in practice, really gain every single day having that reminder with my meals of what it means to practice that obligation. And that was something that was, like I said, the most transformative research project that I ever took part in.